Okay, hi guys. So here to talk to you about SVG, and more specifically, like some of the weirder stuff that maybe you didn't know was kind of hiding inside all that weird XML code. So I won't go into too much on like what we typically use SVG for, just like a little primer. Lots of good resources that I can point you to if you want like a beginner intro. But the basics of why SVG is catching on in the community is, first of all, it's resolution independent. So you have graphics that are defined by a vector path rather than a bunch of pixels. So we can scale them up and down, and that means they're really good for responsive design, icons and logos. People are using SVG a lot for. They come out nice and crisp wherever you're using them. And because they're XML based, it's like code. If you look into the graphic, you can actually understand the code there. You can have really easy like manipulating states with SVG. Like a one-line CSS rule can give you a hover state on an icon without having to use a sprite or anything. So if you dig into that little heart, for example, this is kind of just like some typical SVG code where you've got an SVG element. Most shapes are going to be this path element. And it's just a bunch of coordinates that draw out that shape in vector space. And then you'll have like presentational attributes like fill and stroke that we can fill out as well. Something you might notice here that's really important is there's no like pixels or anything on anything in here. We are going to actually, everything, all these coordinates you see are all relative to that viewbox attribute up at the top. So that 0, 0, 100, 100 is 100 by 100 like canvas in SVG land. So important thing to keep in mind as we're moving around, the viewbox is like super, super important when you're dealing with SVG, and you want to kind of scale everything related to that. And that's going to ensure kind of ultimate responsiveness and flexibility as we work with SVG. So what I want to talk about, though, is that SVG is way more than just simple vector shapes. If you check out like some resources on SVG, you can barely even see that on the screen. I had to shrink it. There are 80 valid SVG elements that you probably didn't know about most of them. 20 minutes doesn't give me time to cover them all, but these are a few of my favorites that I found useful that we're going to look at. There's even a switch statement in SVG like that I found out. Haven't found a use case for it, but it's there. Okay, so first example I wanted to move through is SVG is really good at doing editorialized text. So what I mean by that, something like this, where you've got very specific placement and sizing of fonts. That's something that is kind of tricky to do, with just CSS to get that like right on. And the way that that's going to work is like we just have all these like SVG analogs of stuff. So there's a T-span that acts like a span to control individual elements. And you've got positioning coordinates x, y, dx, and dy. And then the love there to turn it a different color. You can just throw a class on any SVG like subcomponent to affect it with CSS and say change the fill color. So code looks like that. I won't go into like super great details on the code examples, but these are kind of here for reference if you guys want to look at the slides later. But you can kind of see what's going on there. There's a text element, and there's these T-spans for every single line. The great thing about this is that it's totally responsive because we've sized this into the viewbox. Text, I find, is one of like the most annoying things to deal with when you're like doing responsive stuff. So if you have something that's really specific like this, it's going to work well, and it's better than an image because SVG text is still like there on the page and is still totally accessible to search engines, screen readers, that kind of thing. So how do we make it responsive? Remember the viewbox? Size everything to your viewbox, and then you're just going to put it in a flexible container and let the container handle it the same way like image max width 100% works. Another example of editorialized text is text on like a curved path. You can do really easily with SVG. So The way we did this is I just traced out a path, like drew it in Illustrator over top. It's kind of hard to see. There's a really faint red line there. You can really easily get SVG code by exporting it as SVG from vector editing software. And then, so path, this path ID arc is what defines the that arc. And then what you're going to do, instead of just using a text element here, there's this thing called text path. And text path is going to let you fit the text along whatever vector path. So you can do pretty crazy stuff with that. And another kind of common pattern we're going to see, path has an ID, and then it's been linked with this xlink href equals hash arc. So we're linking these two SVG things together. Another really important thing that's going to come up often in here is this defs element. So this, you notice that that arc doesn't actually get rendered on the page anywhere. So that's because we've put it inside defs, which is just a place to define like reusable components that you're going to reference elsewhere. It's really handy at combining different SVG things together. Another thing I have been really a fan of with SVG is interesting fills. So SVG has its own gradient syntax. Nothing too crazy there, different from CSS. You're just going to define your stop colors as their own kind of elements here. And you can control the direction with the X and Y coordinates. Here we've got it going on a gradient. Nothing exciting here when you're just talking about putting it on a rectangle. What I think is cool is if we're going to put that gradient inside a defs element again, so we're saying we're not going to just let this gradient, it actually won't do anything on its own, and then we're going to link it to like another shape. You can start filling like really weird unconventional shapes, not just like rectangles or what you're limited to in CSS. So like anything you want can have a gradient fill, guys. Another cool thing you can do in the same vein is you can fill any shape with an image. How cool is that? Cropping images into weird shapes is like kind of shitty as like far as like labor overhead goes, and also it's expensive if you've got an image with transparency on it. So this one's a little more like complex, but it's going to use a lot of the same things. We're going to learn about a new element here called pattern. So it's kind of a bit of a hack getting an image in here, but what pattern normally does is turns any SVG element into like a tileable pattern. So if you were going to like fill something with polka dots in the background, but I think it's the most fun with using the SVG image element. And more specifically, I think it's the most fun when you start putting gifs inside things. You can fill anything with a gif. So code for that looks like this. We're just sort of building up again, inside that defs, and then inside a pattern. And then you're just linking them together with the ID again. So the fill for this path, that heart-shaped path, is going to be filled with the image that was defined as a pattern fill. It's a lot to kind of keep track of, but it's all there. A few things to keep in mind when you're working with images. Because it's supposed to be a repeating pattern, it can sometimes be tricky to get the image to completely fill your shape properly. But remember your view box, size everything to the view box. If you match the width and height of the pattern, so notice, you can't see the view box here, but it is 100 by 100, and the width and height of both the pattern and the image are both set to the entire view box space. And then this last preserve aspect ratio, oh sorry, one more thing before we get to that. This pattern units, user space on use, says size it to the view box, not to any like shape that's inside of it, not just to the thing it's filling. SVG, because it's XML, kind of quirky sometimes. Make sure your images have both a width and height. If you don't specify, it's going to assume it's 0, and then it just like poof disappears. So always specify a width and height attribute. And then there's this cool preserve aspect ratio attribute that you can do to kind of, it's sort of like a background size cover. one of the ways that you can set it for SVG, again, to ensure. So this is like if I didn't apply it, see how it doesn't fully fill the heart? So it's nice, you don't have to worry about cropping your image to the exact size. Preserve aspect ratio, if you give it the right values, there's a link here to check out. It'll just fill it automatically for you. Okay, let's combine two things that we've learned so far. So how about editorialized text and gradient fills? You get gradient text. Awesome, right? That's something that's been kind of tricky to do before. Most of the examples I saw were using this WebKit background clip to make a clipping path out of the text. Not super cross-browser friendly. Gradient text is going to work almost across the board, with the exception of anything less than IE9. As a caveat to all of this, SVG is not going to do anything there. Hopefully you're like onto supporting IE9 and above by now. Okay, that was fun. Let's do it again. Ready? How about editorialized text plus a GIF fill? What, right? SVG can do that. Like, I think that's madness. I've never seen anything that can do that before, and it's pretty straightforward. So I don't know exactly what you would do with that on like a production website, but I really hope one of you finds a use case. Please tell me if you work that into a project. So one other area I wanted to cover too is interesting image effects. So we'll start out with, as an example of something you can do with SVG, these are my cats. They kind of hate each other sometimes and fight, so only way to get them in a portrait together was to like do the portrait studio thing. But this is actually using a few different SVG techniques here. So it's that image element that we saw before, combined with a radial gradient to do the sort of vignette shape, and then something called a mask. So like, who works in or knows a bit about like, you know, Photoshop and that area? Okay, so a few of you. So like, you might have encountered the concept of a mask. It basically kind of works like a cookie cutter. You can take one shape and like stamp out any other thing. So in this example, we've used like an elliptical shaped, an oval shaped mask to kind of stamp out that image. And the cool thing about a mask, there's also this thing called clip path, which also works like a cookie cutter, but it'll just stamp it out with hard edges. With a mask, you can put gradients in to kind of fade out the edges. So a black fill is going to give you an opaque mask. A white fill gives you a transparent mask. So this is really powerful with gradients. You put basically it's an oval with a radial gradient in it. And that creates the mask to cut out the image. So again, sort of notice here with defs, we've included two different, like, we defined both the gradient and the mask. And then the mask is referencing the gradient. And then I've messed up right here. The ellipse is actually being filled with the gradient. And then the image is using the mask as a mask here. So you can really start like combining all these SVG pieces together to get super creative. And again, look into like these interesting attributes like object bounding box mask units that help you size things properly. Another thing that SVG is pretty good at is filter effects. So here's a cool example where they've got this sort of like iOS 8 like gradient overlay thing going on, where if you take a look at this on the live example, it actually like blurs the background as you scroll down the page, which is super cool. So there's an entire filter element, and this one's using a blur filter, and also like an RGB filter to alter some stuff. And then just as I've been showing you guys primarily just linking stuff up within the SVG directly, but just so you know, you can usually access most SVG attributes from your CSS. So in this case, it's being applied to every single section element. So if you don't want to have to like, repeat that in your markup, you can sort of combine defining things in SVG, hooking them up with CSS rather. Usually the attribute name is just like the CSS property. If you go crazy with filters, you can essentially do like SVG Instagram. Filters get kind of complex and you need a bit of knowledge of image manipulation and how that works, but there's some good tutorials here. So the example that we're looking at is like a combination of, there's a turbulence filter and that creates like noise effects. The blur we saw already is going to make a blur. Component transfer is one that you can actually, you get sub-elements to change RG and B separately, so you can kind of change the color balance on stuff. And then there's actually like light source effects even that you can do. So you can do like shadowing and some interesting stuff there if you dive into filter effects. Another thing SVG is pretty good at is animations. So this is a really popular thing that's been happening a lot lately. Who's seen this before, the like line drawing thing? Okay, so like a few of you. It's starting to show up more and more, and that is SVG down at the bottom. So if you like take a peek, it's SVGs that essentially draw themselves. So this is actually, I'd say, almost like a bit of a hack too, with some interesting attributes. So this is going to rely on you having a path with a stroke, so rather than a filled-in shape. And there's these two attributes that all SVG that you can apply to strokes. One called stroke-array and one called stroke-offset. Check out the reference for like an in-depth explanation. It's kind of beyond what I have time for, but stroke-array allows you to specify basically like a dashed line pattern, but be really precise with like the length of the dashes and the lengths of the gaps. And then stroke-offset just sort of shifts that around so you can control where the dashes start. So we're going to hack it by making basically a dash and a gap that are both as long as the entire shape, and then we're just going to shift it and it gives you that animation effect. So here's a really simple example of just one line. So we have a 100-unit long line, and it has two like dash components, each as long as the line itself, and then you just kind of move it along. You just move along the gap and the filled in part. And you might notice here that I'm animating this right inside the SVG. SVG actually has an animate element that you can animate almost any SVG attribute. You might wonder though, why not just like animate with CSS or JavaScript? Typically those are better and probably more performant tools for achieving this. In the case of the line drawing, that's probably what I would have gone with. Just kind of wanted to show you guys the possibility there. There is one case that I've found that SVG animate is like kind of way better and like gets the job done faster, and that's tweens. Aren't they cute and fashionable? I wish I was that cool when I was a tween. So yeah, SVG can like pretty easily morph shapes from one to another. So I think I have time to show you guys this example that I just kind of went to town with. These are just like a bunch of little SVG shapes. There's one circle that gets like cloned with JavaScript, but the main animation of 1/4 morphing into like an opposite shaped quarter is all done in SVG, and then you can like play around with it in JS to get it to go kind of like kaleidoscopy. So that was kind of fun. Yeah, so a simpler example of this, the way that the morph works is, remember going back to that heart shape, how every single path was defined by a series of points in coordinate space. And it's the D attribute. I think it's like, I can't even remember what D stands for right now. But the path like definition, if you basically, what you see here under, we're saying I'm going to animate the D attribute, and then the values that I want to animate it kind of to and from. It's actually just 2, but in order that it kind of like goes forward and backwards nicely, I've repeated the first value. But these are just 2 sets of like coordinate points that SVG handles the tween and the morph between one shape and another. So that's something that you can't really do without like an external library in JS. So kind of neat that SVG can do that. So there's still like way more that I haven't covered. These are just some of like the weird things that I've found hiding in there and thought were pretty cool. So you know, sort of in the vein of this morning, like just, yeah, go exploring, make stuff up. Like there's just so much that I don't think like a lot of people realize, but it's all documented, it's all there. These are some good resources that I found helpful, and you know, I had honestly just be reading through these and say, oh, like there's that element, like I can do this sort of thing, and go play around with it and like produce some pretty cool results. So I'd encourage you guys to go try and do the same, and you know, in a wider sense, like don't take any technology kind of for granted. Don't, you know, really just like dig into the details and go exploring and see what you find. That's all. Thanks.